Hello, brothers. I had a family event that came up, so I decided to go ahead and record this session where we'll be focused on scene analysis. We'll begin our look into the narrative analysis of narrative texts together. And so here, again, we'll be looking at assignment 2.11, which will be the setting analysis. The assignment actually is setting and scenes analysis. We'll just look at setting analysis in this particular session, and the next session we'll look at the scene analysis. So if you remember, well, we just focused our attention on the first three steps in the last couple of sessions, looking at the book as a whole. Now we're going to move towards the passage level of our study, and we'll be looking first at the first thing we do with narratives is what we call narrative analysis. And narrative analysis, after the first three steps, now that we have an understanding of the book as a whole, we now focus our attention on the story in the book that we want to study. And now that we've sort of got a general idea of the flow of the book, the background of the book, what's in the book, the message of the book, now we're ready to look at the particular stories within the book. Kind of like I described in class with the, think of a book of the Bible like a puzzle. And when you study the book as a whole, that's giving you an overall picture of the book. And then now we can go and look at each piece of the puzzle or each story, each part of the book, and have a better idea of where it fits in the book overall, how it connects to everything around it. And so now that we're ready to do that, we're going to do what we call narrative analysis. And again, that begins with or includes the setting, characters, the scene, and the plot. Those four elements are included in the narrative analysis, and we'll do them in that order. But this session, we're going to focus just on the setting. How do we analyze, understand the setting? And first, we need to know, well, what is the setting? Again, remember, the setting is like the background of the story. It's the background context to the story. It's the when and the where of the story took place. It's the culture in which the story happens. And so we really want to know and understand the setting of the story so that we can then, that'll help us then as we begin to interpret or identify the plot of the story and interpret the story's message. So we want to begin with the where and the when, the setting of the story. Now, the procedure to do the setting is as follows. First, we want to now focus attention on the story and read through the whole story itself several times. All right, we want to give attention to, paying attention to reading it through again and again. I know you read the story through as part of reading through the whole book, but now we want to focus our attention on reading the story itself, by itself, and reading through it several times. All right, and so that's the nature of what we're going to be doing here as we take a look at the story as a whole. We want to start with reading it and then making observations. Right, again, that's always the key to encourage active reading. So what sticks out to you from the story? All right. Do you see anything repeated, any synonyms, anything similar connected to other stories in the book? This would be a time to write down questions. What seems to be the point of the story? How does it seem to fit in the book? You just want to be asking yourself these general kinds of questions and observations. Now, in this step, what I've noticed for some of you, when you make observations, some of you just write down and summarize each verse. That's not what this is. Certainly, there may be some verses you find interesting or important that maybe you want to provide a summary of, but that's not the whole purpose of observations. Observations is just noticing things. What sticks out to you? What grabs your attention? What seems interesting? What seems important? What seems confusing? What do you notice? All right, don't just summarize verses or summarize events and go through verse by verse and do that. That's not the point of this step. The point of this step, you'll do more of that when you do scene analysis. The point of this step is simply just for you to get familiar with the passage and notice things within it. All right, and anything that sticks out to you, anything that seems interesting or important or helpful. Okay. So that's what I want you to do with this. So read the story several times and then make observations. And then Now that you're very familiar with the story, go back and then note all the physical aspects of the story. Again, that is, where does the story happen? And what significant objects are in the story? So like if you're studying the story of like we did in class in Genesis 22, we've got notice the location, the setting started in Bathsheba, and then they made their way to Mount Moriah. But then also you might take note of some other objects in the story, the wood that they carried, the altar that Abraham made, some significant objects contained within the story. Woman at the well, you would take note of the well being in the story. Maybe the woman's bucket for water might be something you point out, as well as the location in Samaria near Sukkar, which is ancient, or it's modern day Shechem, at Jacob's well. Okay, so notice where does the story happen? And then what important objects are in the story? And then next, the temporal aspects, that is time. When does the story happen? When does this story take place? And you won't be given a specific date from the story. It won't tell you. Well, sometimes they do, but usually don't. Sometimes they may tell you in the year of this particular king or something like that. But usually you won't get that. But you may get hints, like in Ruth, in the time of the judges it took place. Or in Jonah, knowing when Jonah was a prophet, which we can find out in 2 Kings, that gives us an idea of when the story took place. Or if you're in one of the Gospels, the stories obviously cover the life of Christ. So it will be, around time period of his life and his ministry on earth. And then sometimes in the story, you'll be given more specifics, like during a Passover or during some particular festival, or you might be given some time frame as far as a few days after or later from a previous event. Like in Genesis 22, I think it says, now after these things, and the things were from Genesis 21. They'd been living in Beersheba, for a while. And Isaac had now become a lad, a young boy, perhaps even a young man. So some years have transpired. So you just get a general idea of when the story, again, happened. Not when it was written, when the story took place. Okay? And then once we understand and identify the who and the when, or the where, excuse me, and the when of the story, then we want to identify, okay, well, about the culture that the story takes place in. Who is in the story? And I don't mean the characters necessarily, but what culture are the characters in? So if we're looking at the book of Jonah, we're going to be interested in not only the culture of the people of Israel in Jonah's day, but also the culture of the Ninevites. What do we know about that culture? What were their religious practices? What do we know about them as a people? And in Ruth, you're going to pay attention to the cultural aspects there of what, some of the cultural practices, meeting at the city gate, the exchange of the sandal, the kinsman redeemer. Those are cultural practices that you want to take note of, knowing that we're talking about Israel in the time of the judges. And those are cultural practices that take place in the story. Okay? So customs, social values, what they believe, those kinds of things. And then finally, the last thing. So we want the where of the story, the physical aspects. We want the when of the story, the temporal aspects. We want the who in the story. That's the culture in which the characters are in. And then finally, any other aspects of the story, the wider context. This might, again, where you might point out just how the story fits, where it's located in the narrative, some things like that, just general connections. All right. So those are the 4 elements for setting analysis. Now, what I'd like to do is go ahead and we'll do Genesis 39 as a practice or an example of setting analysis. Okay. Now, normally, if we're meeting together, I'd have you read the text and spend some time on your own trying to identify the setting. But we'll just, since this is recorded, I'll have to do that step myself. But let me first go ahead and read the story. Again, it's one that I chose because I know it's pretty familiar. And then as I'm reading, I'll read a little bit slower so that you can see if you can identify the setting of the story. Now, we know Genesis 39 takes place after Genesis 38, 37. 37 is the beginning of the Joseph narrative. And so we can know there Joseph as the youngest son of Jacob. So it's sometime after Jacob has settled, and Joseph was the, well, second to youngest son. Benjamin came after him. And this in Genesis 37, if we take a look there in Genesis 37, when the Joseph narrative begins, right, it's saying Jacob lived in the land where his father had sojourned in the land of Canaan. These are the generations of Jacob. Notice Joseph, when 17 years of age, was pasturing a flock with his brothers while he was still a youth. Okay, so now the story in Genesis 37, which again, remember, Genesis 37 to 50 is the whole Genesis narrative. So the setting of that begins when Joseph is just a young man, 17 years old. And then, of course, his dreams that he says, and his brothers get mad at him and they want to kill him. But then Reuben says, don't do that. Don't kill him. And then they threw him in the pit. And Judah ends up being the one to sell their brother Joseph into slavery to some slave traders who were going to Egypt. And so they sold Joseph and then made up the story about that. So he's now being taken to Potiphar's house in Egypt. And then we had chapter 38, which was sort of a side story with Genesis, with Judah and Tamar. Very strange account, but we talked about this in the last session and how this might connect within the Joseph narrative. And then we come to Genesis 39, and it sort of picks up again from the end of 37. Joseph was brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an ancient Egyptian official of Pharaoh, the captain of the bodyguard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him down there. And Yahweh was with Joseph. And so he became a successful man, and he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. Now his master saw that Yahweh was with him, and how Yahweh caused all that he did to succeed in his hand. So Joseph found favor in his sight and attended on him. And he appointed him overseer over his house, and all that he owned he gave into his hand. Let me pick it up here at verse 5. From time to time, increase this. From the time that he made him overseer in his house and over all that he had, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. And the blessing of the Lord was on all that he had in house and field. So he left all that he had in Joseph's charge, and because of him had no concern about anything but the food he ate. Go back to. Now Joseph was beautiful in form, beautiful in appearance. And it happened, I'm in verse 7, after these events, that his master's wife set her eyes on Joseph and said, lie with me. But he refused and said to his master's wife, behold, with me here, my master does not concern himself with anything in the house, and he has given all that he owns into my hand. There is no one greater in this house than I, and he has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do this great evil and sin against God? Verse 10. So it happened that as she spoke to Joseph day after day, he did not listen to her to lie beside her or be with her. Now it happened one day that he went into the house to do his work, and none of the men of the household was there inside. Then she seized him by his garment, saying, lie with me. And he left his garment in her hand and fled and went outside. Now it happened when she saw that he had left his garment and had fled outside, that she called to the men of her household and spoke to them, saying, see, he has brought in a Hebrew to us to laugh at us. He came in to me to lie with me, and I screamed. Now it happened that when he heard that I raised my voice and screamed, he left his garment beside me and fled and went outside. And she placed his garment beside her until his master came home. Then she spoke to him with these words, saying, the Hebrew slave whom you brought to us came in to laugh at me. And as I raised my voice and screamed, he left his garment beside me and fled outside. Okay, so that's That's the story, Genesis 39, that we're going to focus our attention on in doing narrative analysis. And so the first step that we would do normally is then to read through the story again several more times, read through different translations, and then make observations. And so here were some observations that I made as I was going through this particular story. Got the observations here on the left, and then the story itself on the right. And just a few things I noticed. I noticed that the Lord was with Joseph and he became successful. The narrator emphasizes that point again because he noticed the Lord caused all that he did to succeed. Right? Joseph found favor in the sight of Potiphar, his master, and so his master made him overseer over the whole house. So these were some interesting feature I noticed. The narrator points out, by the way, he makes this comment about Joseph's appearance. And why does he do that? It seems because then he talks about how Potiphar's wife. And I said a bulk of the story is an interaction of Potiphar's wife with Joseph. And I wondered, one of the questions I had was, why did the author give so much detail about that? Because if you notice, basically here from verse 7 all the way down, it's just about this interaction that they had and how she kept saying to lie with me, and Joseph refused. And so that stuck out to me. Another thing that I noticed is how Joseph said, how could I do this wicked thing and sin against God? And even though the sin would have been against Potiphar, right? If he had slept with Potiphar's wife, Joseph saw this as a sin beyond just Potiphar, but against God himself. Another thing that stuck out to me was how she said day after day, she spoke to Joseph. She kept enticing him, kept trying to make her advances. And then another thing that caught my eye is down in verse 20, after Joseph was accused by Potiphar's wife, I wondered, why didn't Potiphar kill him? I'm sure that could have been an option, but instead, notice it says that he put him in prison. So I just as a question, why he didn't do that. And then why was he put with the king's prisoners? Notice it says the place where the king's prisoners were confined. That was another question that stuck out to me. Again, I noticed it says, we didn't read this part, but the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison put Joseph in charge of all the prisoners who were in the prison. Whatever was done there, he was the one who did it. The keeper of the prison paid no attention to anything that was in Joseph's charge because the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made him succeed. So notice again what stuck out to me, verse 23. It says the Lord was with him. Verse 21, the Lord was with Joseph. That was something, in fact, I'll do it in different color because that's something that was mentioned several times in the story. It was mentioned a couple of times when he first entered into Potiphar's house, and Lord was with him, he was successful. And then it's mentioned when he went into the prison. So that seems to be a focus here. And then we have this pattern, right? Where Joseph gets put somewhere, and then he prospers, he succeeds, and then Joseph is given responsibility. Notice he put Joseph in charge, mentions there, just like Potiphar did, right? Joseph noted, he's put everything in my charge. And then even then, from here, Potiphar left all in Joseph's charge. He had no concern about anything but the food he ate. And then that was the same thing mentioned down here. The keeper of the prison paid no attention to anything that was in Joseph's charge. So you see sort of this repetition, this pattern that stuck out to me. And then something else I noticed, that there were 5 references to Joseph's garment, right? That she mentions in the story. Verse 12, he left his garment. Verse 13, he had left his garment. Verse 15, he left his garment. Verse 16, she laid up his garment. 18, he left his garment. So it's like repetition there. And then another question that I had was how long was Joseph in Potiphar's house? Doesn't really say, right? It just says that he was brought down to Egypt and he was there, and some time passed because he became successful and his master put him in charge over everything. So it's not clear exactly how long. And then I mentioned over here a few things that were repeated in the story. There's some other things repeated too, but those were things that stuck out to me. Okay, so I spent, 20, 30 minutes just reading through the story again several times and then just looking for things that stuck out to me, things I had questions about, things that seemed repeated or emphasized. So that's what I did for setting analysis. First step, read and observe. Okay. Okay, now that we've done that, we've gotten familiar with the story, then the next step in the setting analysis is to identify the physical aspects of the story. Where did the story take place? Well, it takes place in Egypt, right? Joseph had been brought down to Egypt. All right, and specifically, he lived in Potiphar's house. He had been brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar bought him from the Ishmaelites. And then he was in the house of his Egyptian master. Okay, so let's see what color I can highlight this in. All right, Joseph had been brought down to Egypt. All right, so he's in Egypt in the house of Potiphar. And he was then, the setting changes at the end of the story, he was put in prison. All right, so we would note physical aspects of the story. Now, you may want to include, actually, I think it probably would be prudent to include the physical objects mentioned. One was Joseph's garment. It makes you wonder, is this connected back to his coat of many colors? Is there something there that's being connected by Moses? Don't know for sure. Would have to give that some thought, but that would be something to take note of. Any other physical objects here that stick out? Nothing comes to my mind in that regard. Okay. The garment seems to be the only thing that's emphasized. All right. Now the when of the story. Well, the events of the story, right, Genesis 39, cover the time when Joseph was in Potiphar's house and then he was put in prison. Now, I noted to you earlier, we read Genesis 37. Joseph was 17 years old when he was sold into slavery. He was with the Ishmaelites. They were going down to Egypt. Certainly, it probably wasn't with them more than a few months, definitely not more than a year. So it's reasonable to assume perhaps Joseph was 17 or 18 years old when he came to Potiphar's house. Now, if we go a little bit later in the narrative, we go to Genesis 41, we can take note of the fact that take note of the fact that Joseph, we were given his age in Genesis 41. Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh. Okay, well, that's a helpful piece of information. He was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh, and he was in jail for at least 2 years, remember, or probably longer than that, because remember back, the cupbearer and the baker had the dreams, Joseph interpreted. Well, it was 2 years after that, after the cupbearer was released, that Pharaoh had the dream. So it'd be at least 2 years, but then it probably was some time as Joseph was establishing himself in the prison and became elevated. So, that could have been at least a few years. So it seems likely Joseph was probably with Potiphar from when he was 18 till maybe, 27 years old, something like that. 26, 27 years old. We don't know how long he was in the prison. But that it just gives us a rough idea. Okay. I'm sure we're within a year or two. Okay. So the events of Genesis 28 seem to take place when Joseph is 18 to 28 years old. We know that for sure because he's at least not more, maybe 17 or 18 when he came to Potiphar's house. And we know that he was 28 when he had that interaction with the cupbearer and the baker, because 2 years later, and let me just remind us of this, 2 years later, notice verse 1 of chapter 41, at the end of 2 full years, Pharaoh had a dream. That's when he went to Pharaoh, interpreted the dream. And then Genesis 41:46 says Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh. So we know for sure he's 30 years old when he's standing before Pharaoh interpreting the dream. We know that he was 28 years old because it's 2 years earlier when he interpreted the dream of the cupbearer. And then, again, 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 years, we don't know for sure, before that when he was thrown into prison. But we definitely know he's between 18 and 28 in the whole chapter. And then probably at least 8 years, maybe 9 years, he stayed in Potiphar's house. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. So you notice here, we have to go outside the chapter in order to get the more details about the timing. And that's pretty common, right? When you're doing narratives, especially if they're sequential, there's going to be, you need to take note of what's mentioned outside of the particular story before and after to get an idea of when the story took place. All right, so the setting as far as time is when Joseph's around 18 to 28 years old. Okay. Now, cultural aspects of the story. These are things we would want to explore. What was Egypt like in those particular days? What was slavery like? What did it involve in Egypt at that time? Again, we know later in the generations after Joseph, when the Egyptians took the Israelites and made them slaves, we know what that situation looked like. But what was slavery like before that time? Again, we have Potiphar, right, had Joseph as a slave. And it seems there that some slaves take a lot of responsibility, right? That's what happened to Joseph while he was in Potiphar's house. How about Egyptian prisons? Do we know anything about them? And again, there seems to be some anti-Semitism, even back before Israel was established as a nation. There was anti-Semites, right? That those remarks about this Hebrew, you brought this Hebrew in to make fun of us. So there's that cultural issue. Other aspects of the story. This story immediately follows the story of Judah and Tamar, which again could serve partly as a contrast between Joseph and Judah, right? Judah has sex with his daughter-in-law, who he thinks is a prostitute, and but Joseph, on the other hand, does everything he can to avoid committing adultery with Potiphar's wife. But I think there's more going on there than just that. And we would need to look at the whole Joseph narrative to really understand. I pointed out to you, by the way, right, that we have, if you want to just have a hint of what to consider here, right, in Genesis 37, remember, Judah was the one who sold, where is it? Judah said to his brothers, let's sell him. So they sold. Judah's the one who initiated that. And then if we were to look earlier, Judah was the one, he did some other things that displeased Jacob. But then if we go to Genesis, I think it's, I don't remember. Right, Judah seems to take an active role in the whole issue. If you remember, right, when Joseph didn't reveal himself yet and sent his brothers back with the grain, but also put the valuable objects in there, then Judah really steps up and shows a change in character, and even says if anything happens, that he would take care of Benjamin, and if not, then he would suffer the consequence. He would take the consequences upon himself. And then even as we get towards the end, Judah just takes this prominent role. Judah stays in the prison with Joseph and instead of Benjamin. So he shows this noble character, almost a change of heart in his character in the course of the story. And so it's really interesting. And it seems that Genesis 38 is where things change. So that's something to just keep in mind. The connection of chapter 38 to the broader narrative. And you would get into that more when you're studying Genesis 38, the narrative analysis there. But that's it. That's the setting analysis. Let me just show you here is assignment 2.11. All right, so the setting and scene analysis for Ruth or Jonah. And we just covered the first part here, the setting analysis. So the steps are given, but notice for the assignment, you're doing both setting and scene. All right, don't miss that. It's not just the setting analysis. You're also going to do the scene analysis for this, for your story. Because as we saw here with Genesis 38, and for these shorter stories, the setting analysis will be pretty quick. We did this in just a short period of time. So I combine these two. So the setting analysis procedure, and then I do an example from Genesis 22 that we did in class. All right, where you'll do the read and observe, the physical aspects of the story, the temporal aspects of the story, the cultural aspects, and then any others. All right, so you're going to do the setting analysis for your particular story. So if you've been assigned, Ruth chapter 2, you'll do the setting analysis just for Ruth chapter 2. Okay. I think, well, hold on a second. Let me confirm that, because I think let me check. Yeah, just for, carry out, sorry, the setting analysis. Here, I better highlight this for the entire book of the passage you've been assigned. Okay, so you're going to do the setting for the whole book. Now, Ruth and Jonah is very small. All right, so just give us the setting of the book. So you'll start in chapter 1 and just pay attention to, when does each story take place? And I already mentioned to you the timing of Jonah can be found by looking for where Jonah is mentioned in 2 Kings. Timing of Ruth is given right at the beginning of the story, time of the Judges. All right, so you get the location there and the time, and then so you keep that in mind. So do it for the entire book. Okay, so read through the book, and then note all the physical aspects of the book, of the story, the whole book. Maybe I should. Where does it happen? When does it happen? And then any other aspects. All right, and then you will do the scene analysis, and here you will do it just for your assigned passage. All right, so if you have Ruth chapter 2, you'll do the setting analysis for the book of Ruth, and then you'll do the scene analysis just for Ruth chapter 2. So identify each scene in your story. Okay, all right, for your story, Ruth or Jonah. Okay. So hopefully that makes sense. You're going to do the setting for the book, and then I want you to do the scene analysis for each your assigned passage. Now, next session, I'll go over with you the steps for the scene analysis. So this session, we just covered the setting analysis and went through an example. Next session, we'll look at the scene analysis for the what the scene analysis involves, and we'll go through Genesis 39 as the example. Okay, so this would be video will be just a short one. We're just focused on the setting, and then part two, we'll look at the scene analysis that we'll have for you next session. Okay. Again, any questions? Feel free to contact me, message me, and ask. I believe this assignment is not due until June 22nd, I believe. So you still have a little bit of time, and I'll try to get you a review with you, the scene analysis, before it is due, so you can have an idea of that as well. Okay. Well, I hope this was helpful, and I'll continue to pray for you to just continue working on your assignments and getting those completed, and I'll help you any way that I can, anything that you need. Okay. God bless you, brothers, and look forward to seeing you soon.